Hey there, this is a ground sheet, this is a tarp, and in this video I'm going to show you how to use these for a tent. And what we're going to cover in this video is, first, I'm going to talk about the purpose of using these, like why you might use these for a tent in the first place. Second, I'm going to kind of compare the two, tell you the difference between using a ground sheet and a tarp, because they are a bit different in a few ways. And then I'm going to show you how to use each of these when you're setting it up under a tent. And there's some common mistakes that people make when they're doing this, and so I'm going to try to help you avoid those. Let's get started. First of all, we're going to talk about the purpose of using a tarp and a ground sheet, and they really have the same purpose when you're tent camping, and it's two things. So first of all, it's to protect the bottom of your tent from any damage from sticks and rocks and other things that are on the ground. You don't want it to rip your tent or just cause damage to the bottom of your tent. So that's one purpose of using these. The second purpose is really just to keep your tent dry, especially the bottom of your tent. So if it's recently rained or it's just wet conditions out, then this can really help separate your tent from that moisture. And then also when you're camping overnight, if you've been camping outside before, you probably know this. If you're new, maybe this will be news to you, but it'll kind of create dew in the grass and on the ground overnight. And so having the tarp and the ground cloth can be really helpful to keep that moisture off of the bottom of your tent. So that's kind of the main purpose of using these. And now let's talk about the differences between the two. So the tarp and the ground cloth are a little bit different. The primary difference between the two is that a ground cloth or a ground sheet, which I have here, is specifically fitted for a particular tent brand and model. So this is the ground cloth for the REI Half Dome tent, which I'm gonna set up later in this video. And so this was purchased specifically for that tent, and the dimensions of it are cut perfectly to the size of the bottom of that tent. And so it fits really well, which is one of the nice things about having a ground cloth. Tarps tend to be cut in basically standard dimensions, standard rectangular or square dimensions. And so when you're using it for a tent, often you're going to have to fold it or kind of manipulate it in some ways to get it to fit under your tent properly. And one other difference between the two that I'll mention is that the tarps like this they tend to be bigger, bulkier, but also quite a bit cheaper. So that's just something to keep in mind if you're thinking about getting a tarp or a ground cloth. So I also want to mention that with these different purposes I mentioned, I will often go camping and not use a tarp or a ground cloth, especially if I'm backpacking. If I'm going on a backpacking trip and I want to just save some extra weight that I don't have to carry, I'll often just kind of not use these. And I've had pretty good luck with the bottom of my tent, and I haven't really gotten any rips or problems with it. I'm sure it would stay drier with a tarp or a ground cloth, but all that just to mention, you don't have to use it. I think some people have the sense or the feeling that you have to always use a ground cloth or a tarp, but that's not true. You don't have to, but it can be helpful. So next we're gonna go back here and I'm gonna show you how to set this up with the tent properly, and I'll point out one or two mistakes that are common so that you can avoid them for yourself. All right, let's move over there. All right, so first we're gonna put up the tent over the ground cloth here. And for a ground cloth, it's pretty simple. You just lay out the tarp ground cloth like I have it here. And these ground cloths here, they have little eyelet loops here, and we'll try to do a close-up on this a little bit later. But the way this one works is we'll lay the tent out on top of it, set it up with these poles, and then the poles on the end, they actually go through both the tent and the ground cloth, so that kind of fastens them together. On a different ground cloth, you might just have to stake it out, but for this one, it just goes right through these eyelet holes. And so we're gonna set this up, and then after that, I'll show you how to do it with the tarp. With the tarp, that's the one where there's kind of more mistakes that you could make, but we'll get to that one later. So let's set this up first. Okay, here's our close-up on the little eyelets here that it has. So you can see, if you set up a tent before that's kind of like this one, you can see that the main pole goes through the tent here. But then it has like a little bit of extra space where you can take the ground cloth's eye loop and put it on like that. So that's how this one works. And then once you've got that down, it has this strap that comes out the end. And then you can use this for staking out both your tent and your tarp. If you want to be, I guess, extra secure, you can put this loop that's attached to the tent around it as well. and yeah, do it that way. So I put my ground cloth away, and now I got my tarp out so I can show you how to do it with this. So it's a little bit different, and you gotta kind of make sure that things are sized appropriately because it isn't specifically cut for the size of this tent. So I've got my tarp laid out, and now I'm gonna grab my tent and put it on top so I can show you the problem that often happens here. So there's my tent on my tarp. And what you can probably see here, and this is coming out both ends, my tarp is a little bit too wide. It's too wide. And so the reason, some people will do this and some people will think, hey, what a great place to put my shoes so that I just have like a nice spot to put my shoes. But actually, think of it this way. What if it rains? What if it rains and then you have this little piece of tarp out here? It's basically acting as a little funnel to take a river of water right underneath your tent. So this can actually be a bad thing, especially if it's gonna rain out, because the tarp can be like a funnel for that rain to go under your tent. So there's basically two ways you can fix this. If you're setting this up and you see, okay, the tarp is a problem, one thing you can do is you can just take the tarp and you can just tuck it under, like this. Okay, just go all the way along it and then tuck it under. And I'm taking the end and I'm tucking it under because I like to do that, because if you go up and over, then theoretically it can like grab a little bit of moisture and make like a little bucket. And so I'm trying to not make a water bucket here as I'm tucking it under. There, you don't want any of it to be sticking out. And so that's one way you could do it. And then the second thing that you can do is, if you're like before your trip, or if it's dry out and you have the time to check it, you can just set the tarp up individually and see like, oh, okay, maybe if I just fold this in half, then it'll be the right size. And after you've done it a few times, you might kind of get an idea for where in your tarp you need to make your folds, so that you can just do that with your tarp initially, and then you can put the tent, set the tent up on top and do it that way. So those are the ways that you can do it, but the basic premise is you just want to make sure that the tarp is not sticking out after you put the tent on top. And after that, there's not really much more to it. One other difference with the tarp and the ground cloth is, instead of having those little loops like you had with the ground cloth, a tarp often still has those, but they're probably not fitted exactly to the tent. And so I will often just put my tarp underneath the tent loose and count on the stake points on the sides of my tent to hold that tarp under there. But you could potentially, depending on the type of tarp you have, you could potentially still stake certain points of it if you fold it well, just as some like added security to keep your tarp under there. But personally, I usually just let it be loose, especially if I'm car camping. So that's really all there is to it. That's how to use a tarp and a ground cloth. If you have any questions about how to do this, then I encourage you to leave a comment. I'd be happy to answer them. And if you have found this helpful and you like outdoors and camping, then subscribe to our channel and join us here for the next one.